Hi, I'm Skyler. Welcome to AgamidCG, the channel where I teach creatives how to think through problems and learn new skills. For the last month, I've gave myself a pretty simple challenge. Every day, sculpt something. Not the same thing over and over, but 30 completely different prompts. Creatures, hands, vehicles, skulls, characters. Just pick something, start sculpting, and stop after about an hour. By the end of the month, I had finished 30 completely different sculpts. Now, they're nothing special, but that's not really the point. Because somewhere around the middle of this challenge, I started noticing something interesting. The thing that was improving wasn't just the sculpting, it was how I was approaching the sculpting. One of the weird things that happens when you start to do the same thing every single day is that patterns just start showing up. You begin to notice the same problems again and again, and they start just popping up everywhere. For me, one of the biggest ones was that I jumped into detail way too early. I'd start sculpting ahead, but within minutes, I'd be working on the lips, teeth, eyes, and tiny details, which feels productive like you've progressed so far, but it isn't. Because if the big overall structure isn't correct, the details don't really matter. Later in the challenge, I did a skull study, and suddenly a bunch of things about faces started to make a lot more sense. The skull explains where the forms sit where they do, and once that form is even roughly correct, everything is much easier to place. So now I try to stay in the big shapes a lot longer than feels comfortable. Another thing that surprised me was how much control comes from making small adjustments. Early in the challenge, I used really big, heavy brush strokes, and that allowed me to move around the form, but I would push it too much and have to fix it, and then I would push it and fix it, and I ended up in this constant cycle of correction. But once I started lowering and controlling my brush intensity, I was able to control the sculpt a lot more, and it became more predictable. You don't have to fight the sculpt nearly as much, and that sounds obvious in hindsight, but you really don't notice unless you've been doing it for a few days. So there's also a phase of sculpting that I used to rush through, especially in this challenge, and that's the block out. Some people call it the rough shape or the ugly phase, basically the time when everything just looks kind of wrong. Earlier in the challenge, I just wanted to get out of this phase as quickly as possible because it was really uncomfortable. But as the challenge went on, I started to realize that this phase is where a lot of the problems get solved. If the silhouette works and the proportions are right, then defining the sculpt is just so much easier. So in a lot of my later sculpts, I stayed very low resolution for a lot longer. This allowed me to just push around shapes and play with volume. Another interesting thing that came up in this challenge was just how I thought about reference. Sometimes I had too little reference and I would end up guessing anatomy, and of course this gave me a terrible result. And sometimes I had way too much reference and I would end up spending half the sculpt just trying to figure out which direction I wanted to go in. Somewhere in the middle is the correct amount of reference, just enough that you know what you're building and you have the information to fill in the gaps, but not too much that you end up spending the entire time studying instead of actually making something. And I think in this case, having the 1 hour time slot actually forces you to have to go with your reference really quickly. Otherwise, you'll notice that half the time is gone and you just spent it all looking at your reference. One thing that just kept happening through this challenge was these tiny little workflow discoveries. Little things like a masking shortcut, or better ways to isolate different parts of the mesh, or switching to a certain brush, or using a different tool entirely for hard surface modeling. None of these feel like big breakthroughs in the moment, but they stack up. Probably one of the most important things that happened during this challenge is something that can be a little frustrating. At some point as you get better, you start seeing problems that you just can't fix yet. You'll look at this and you'll see, oh, something is wrong, but you don't know exactly why. And you definitely don't know how to correct it. It's like your artistic eye is at a higher level than your actual skills. This feeling showed up a lot more towards the end of the challenge, especially with things like eyes and facial features that are really recognizable and common for humans to get that uncanny valley. But that's not failure, that's just your eyes improving faster than your hands, which I think is a good sign. So of course, 30 days isn't enough time to become great at sculpting. It's not even close. But it's long enough to notice something important. When you remove the friction of what you need to practice, and you simply sit down and make something every day, your brain starts to pay attention to the process. You notice the mistakes, you notice the shortcuts, you notice what actually matters. And that focus, consistency adds up surprisingly quickly. Try the challenge yourself. Follow all my prompts for all 30 days. All you have to do is follow along and see where you end up. And if you do try it, share your results. I'd love to see what you end up making, what you struggled with along the way, and maybe something that you learned. Thanks for watching, and keep building.